Greetings and welcome to Overview of Contracts, Defining Contract. We're going to do a little overview of a lot of familiar territory here as we deal with contracts every day. And the point being is that there's some that we're aware of, some that we're
List V
not.
2001 says long live Bob Ware.
Ah, the Grateful Dead. Did he pass? All right, yeah, rest in peace. That said, the overview here should be something of familiar territory, but also to reinforce those fundamentals to help us better understand where the contracts and the intersection with our lives really matters. And before we begin, to remind everyone, this is strictly for the entertainment and educational purposes of this YouTube channel, broadcast not to be used, misconstrued, or abused for anything personal, private, legal, lawful, business, tax, financial, or otherwise. So please don't do this at home. That said, let's get started. So we're doing our definitions of contract. So let's look at what we're going to go over. After this presentation, which won't be very long, you're going to be able to define a legally binding contract, explain the concept of offer and acceptance, classify contracts into bilateral or unilateral agreements. You'll explain the difference between executory and executed contracts, and you'll be able to pronounce it too. You'll be able to discuss various contractual provisions, identify the 6 basic requirements for forming a valid contract, define and exemplify consideration, which is one of those requirements, understand how a contract is created, the difference between a valid, void, voidable, and unenforceable contracts, and you'll also know what is meant by the term contractual capacity. So, lots to learn. Let's get started. So, let's first look at the 6 basic requirements. These are the ones that most are already familiar with when it comes to contracts. So, first, of course, there's the offer. Second, the acceptance. Third, a consideration. 4, a legality of subject matter, meaning it's legal to execute. 5, a contractual capacity. And 6, a contractual intent. So we have here the offer, acceptance, consideration. Then we have legality, of course, the capacity, and the intent. Now there's a pervasiveness of contracts in our daily life, whether we know it or not. So rent or mortgage is a contract with a landlord or a lender. Purchasing items like a toothbrush, toothpaste, clothes involve contractual transactions. There's news and media, even a simple sales transaction. And public transportation, there's a contract with a municipality. In fact, even air travel is considered public transportation on the major airlines. Every aspect of normal life is dominated by contractual principles, and that's what we're going to be diving into here. Let's continue. So let's get this defined. The definition of a contract: a legally enforceable agreement that meets specified legal requirements between 2 or more parties, in which each party agrees to give and receive something of legal value. So both parties, or two or more, and each party agrees to give and receive something of legal value. So this is a legally enforceable agreement. So it's a special kind. So let's look at some other kinds of transactions. We have our not even really transactions, but interactions. Here we have a contract versus a gift. A contract is where each party gives and receives something of legal value. A gift, only one party gives, the other receives. So agreement is not a contract because not all agreements meet those specified requirements needed to create a contract, which we saw in the previous slide. But we're going to be going over to in detail. So let's look at this again now. Our basic contract requirements, the 6 requisite elements: offer, consideration, acceptance, And then we have legality.
Audit them says, hit the like.
Indeed, and greetings to you, and welcome, Audit Them. So these are the 6 elements. If all 6 elements are not present, no contractual relationship exists. So they all have to be present, all 6, all inclusive there. Enforceability considerations. Now, when it comes down to that legality, we also have the statute of frauds, that certain contracts must be in writing to be enforceable. We have statutes of limitations. There's a time limit for bringing legal action for contract breach. So for it to be legally enforceable, it has to be within those statutes of limitations. Even with all 6 elements present, contract may be unenforceable due to statutory reasons. So that's the key caution here. Let's move along. So let's break this down even more. The 6 requisite elements. There's 1, the offer. A proposal manifesting intent to enter into a valid contract. So there's going to be first an offer, a proposal, manifesting intent. Remember, there's also that contractual intent. All right, then we have number 2 is the acceptance, the manifestation of assent to the offer proposed. And then for 3, there's a consideration. That's the bargain of the contract, the benefit conferred or detriment incurred. Then, of course, we have the legality of subject matter. Contract must be formed for a legal purpose and fulfill statutory regulations. And we get to our contractual capacity, the legal ability of a person to enter into a contractual relationship. That way it can be legally enforced. And, of course, contractual intent, the purposefulness of forming a contractual relationship. All 6 elements must be present for a valid contract to exist. Valid contract. Let's continue because we're going to really be breaking this down. Got a lot to learn here. Let's start with the offer. Definition of the offer is a proposal by one party to another, manifesting an intention to enter into a valid contract. Every valid contractual relationship starts with an offer. Here's an example. One student asks another, "Will you buy my used contracts book for $50? The student has started a proposal to sell a particular object, the used book, at a particular price, $50. So there's your offer. The offer defines the boundaries of the potential relationship. It empowers the other party to create the contract by accepting to fulfill that second requirement. And without the initial proposition, no contractual relationship can develop. So it all starts with the offer as the first step in any contract. So you make the offer. Will you buy this for this? So we go on to the acceptance. The definition is to create the contract, the party to whom the offer is made must accept the proposal. So the law will not force a person to fulfill an obligation to which they have not agreed. So they must, to create that contract, the party to whom the offer is made must accept that proposal. That makes a mutual assent. The offer and acceptance combined create the agreement that parties intend to be contractually bound. So those 2 elements right there, offer and acceptance, create the agreement. Here's an example. The paralegal student says, "Okay, I'll take the book." A contract has been created because the student has agreed to the proposal of the seller. We saw on our previous slide here. One student asks the other, "Will you buy my used contracts book for $50 is the offer. And the acceptance is, "Okay, I'll take the book." A contract has been created. You have an offer and an acceptance. It's a meeting of the minds is essential. Parties must genuinely intend to be bound. So that intention is here. This is where it's manifest. Without mutual assent, no valid contract exists, regardless of the other elements. So this is that meeting of the minds here with the acceptance. We're on to the third requirement here, which is consideration. Definition is it's the subject matter of the contract, the thing for which the parties have bargained. So each party must give and receive something of value. Key principle here is monetary worth is not the ultimate determining factor of legal value. So the monetary worth is not the ultimate determining factor. Let's look at the monetary consideration. So the seller receives $50. The buyer receives the used contracts book. Here's a non-monetary consideration. The used contracts book for a used torts book. No money changes hand. So we have the exchange of $50 for the used contract book, or an exchange of a used torts book for the used contracts book. There's a monetary consideration, the first one. The second one's a non-monetary consideration. And the big difference here, as we saw from the previous episode on money, is that it's the quantification of the money, the measurable, the number that's put to it. That's one of the functions of money. And when it's a exchange, such as a book for book, there's no need for that quantification, that numerical value. Books themselves in the second
Biagin
example.
Jones, 4492 says the principal and agent relationship of the currency of the private company is used.
Oh, the private companies, yeah. And these are just getting to the elements, and you'll see how this applies in so many different areas, including public and private. In fact, because of the nature of contracts, as we'll see here as we continue on here, as there are many flavors, but just to get down to the basic requirements is essential to really have a grasp on all the nuances here. Because you see here, consideration doesn't have to be of money, but it does have to be of value. So we're on to the legality now of the subject matter. So we went over the first three, which are the most important. Now we get to the legality of the subject matter. So to be valid, a contract can only be formed for a legal purpose and must fulfill any statutory regulations with respect to form. So the contract must comply with laws and regulations, and even if all other requirements are met, the contract is unenforceable if illegal. So here's an example, a price fixing agreement. Acme Incorporated and Goodyear agreed to run Dunlop out of business by fixing prices. So if anyone wanted, it's an illegal agreement. So it would not be a valid contract. So here the contract meets all other requirements, but it violates U.S. antitrust laws. So it's not an enforceable contract. It's not formed for a legal purpose. Boy. Okay, now we're on to the contractual capacity. And for those of you who just got here, as you saw before, we do have the talking chat enabled. So if you go ahead and you type any of your comments into the chat, we will be alerted right away on screen and through the talking chat so that we can participate and get some feedback here as we go along for any kind of clarity or any other kind of input we want to do. And let's test out here.
The tribe says, hit the like.
Yes, indeed, and it's on and working. Let's proceed. So now we're on to the capacity. Here's a definition of contractual capacity: the ability of a person to enter into a valid contract. So some of the things here are age. Minors are generally lacking their contractual capacity, of course, and mental condition. Mental impairment affects capacity. The law protects those who may lack the experience and judgment to contract. So here's an example. John, a precocious 14-year-old, he wants to buy woodland for potential real estate development. Nice. Although potentially profitable, the law considers a 14-year-old incapable of entering into a contract. So the age and presumed lack of experience make him contractually incapable. Wow. Wants to buy a woodland for potential real estate development. Precocious little kid there, huh? All right. Now we're on to contractual intent. The definition here is a subjective intent to form a contractual relationship. So it's all pervasive element. It affects the entire contract. Remember, we even get to the second element where we're talking about manifesting intent. So it's not always discernible from words. You got to analyze the surrounding circumstances, which is why the acceptance is the one where you can really see the evidence of intent. Even if all other requirements are met, no contract without intent. Here are some examples, though. Here's Kevin's house sale. Agrees to sell his house for $500,000. Contract is in writing, describes a house, and specifies payment terms. Problem is that Kevin was forced to sign at gunpoint, so it was no free will. So the contractual intent's not there. That 6 elements missing because he was forced to sign at gunpoint against his will. And then we have William's housekeeper agreement. William agrees to pay Sally $500 a week to be a housekeeper. He's 85 years old, not Sally. The reality is Sally convinced him that no family wanted him. He'd be alone without her. So it was mental coercion. So it wasn't out of his free will again. So there's no contractual intent. So that contract won't hold up for that $500 a week or however that was.
Sawyer Stash says a contract is a contract.
Yes, but a legal and a valid contract is what we're talking about here. It may still be a contract, but it doesn't meet all these requirements in every way, especially the statutory ones. It's not legally enforceable. It doesn't mean it's not in some ways a contract, but a legally enforceable and valid contract is what we're talking about here. Is best practice and is just from fundamental view, so we get an idea of how these really stack together to form the more complex the more complex forms of contracts, which we're going to be getting into very briefly because we are going to cover a lot in this, and it's not too long. We're almost done here. And you will be walking away with a much better knowledge, even if you are familiar with contracts. Let's continue here. So the classification of contracts. Now we're getting into the nitty gritty here, but here's an easy way to do it. And I hope you're not too hungry, but we're going to go by the menu concept here. So we have
Rosliner 2689 says, is a marriage a contract?
Oh, yes. Yeah, of course. But we're going to get into that in a little more detail in a second here in the type because we have classification categories, which will help understand this a little bit better. And that's why we're going over this stuff because it really answers a lot of simple questions by understanding the foundations of this. So we have 5 classification categories. So think of this like, a menu in a Chinese restaurant or something where you get to pick one from each of these numbers here. And here's broccoli and snow peas instead of bilateral, unilateral. You got to pick one of those, and you go to the next one. It's going to be, tofu or chicken or beef or whatever. Get to pick one of those. And then on to 3, you pick one of those 2, formal or informal. So you got 5 classification categories. Let's look at them. 1, it's the type of obligation. You have to pick one of these, bilateral or unilateral. We're going to be going into more detail, don't worry. Number 2, there's a method of creation. There's express, implied, or quasi-contracts. Ooh, boy. Then there's 3, the type of form. Is it formal or informal? Pick one. Then 4th is the timing. Is it executory or executed? So we're going to get into these in detail in a moment. And number 5, enforceability. Valid, void, voidable, or unenforceable. So another real detailed item there, number 5 of enforceability. So the 5 classification categories. But we're going to go through this with the menu concept. We're going to take, it's like making selections from a restaurant menu. You take one item from each category, complete the selection process, and the result, the contract is formed. So we're going to classify contracts prior to analyzing validity and provisions. So before we do all that, we're going to figure out what kind of contract we're dealing with. So let's start with number 1, the type of obligation. 2 choices, bilateral contract or unilateral contract. bilateral is a promise for a promise. An example: will you buy my used contracts book for $50? Reply is okay. So, a contract is formed at exchange of promises.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says what name is used on the instrument contract was an appellation used or name and whom signed or autography contract was done in the capacity as principal or agent.
Yeah, and that gets into some of the details of those elements there. It used to be the seal. You'd use your seal, and in some states they've had different statutes now that interpret that differently. So again, it's about the enforceability of the contracts, what we're going over here, not whether they're actually a contract or not in the parties to it, but the elements of the contracts themselves, what makes them a contract and how to classify them so we could better recognize them and, of course, better write them. So with a bilateral contract, it's a promise for promise. We buy my used contract book for $50, offer, then okay, the acceptance. The contract is formed in exchange of promises. The performance occurs after the agreement. The remedies are available if the promise is broken. So that's a bilateral. Now with a unilateral, it's a promise for an act. Here's an example. Allison promises to pay me $1,500. Or promises to pay $1,500 if Tim paints her apartment on Wednesday. So it's a promise to pay for an act. The contract is formed only when the act is performed. There's no remedy until the requested act is completed. Performance equals acceptance. So here we have the exchange of promises, right, after an acceptance. But here the performance equals the acceptance. So if he never paints the apartment, the performance was never done, and it's based on a promise to pay.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says legal or lawful meeting of the minds. Fatuus presumitur qui improprio nominarity is presumed incompetent to mistakes his own name.
Well, again, that's the point I'm trying to make. Where is it being enforced? If it's being legally enforced, then you have to follow those rules. If it's just a matter of law, then that's a different aspect. And again, after going through the classifications, these things will become a lot more evident. Here's the point, is that with a bilateral, the performance occurs after the agreement. And here, the unilateral contract, the performance becomes the acceptance because there's an act involved, not just a promise for promise. There's a promise for an act. So the promises might be able to be made simultaneously, but the act needs to be performed. So we have a delay here. As you see here, the contract is formed when the act is performed. But the contract here is formed in the bilateral at an exchange of promises. So it's a different time of conception here. Let's move along. Here's the method of creation, the second category here. There's three kinds here. We have an express contract, an implied in fact contract.
Craig Curry G5E says so the performer can just dip out.
Because there would be no contract until the act is done. Then if the act's done and she doesn't pay the $1,500, then there's a remedy in law. All right, let's move along here. So the express contract, it's a mutual assent manifested in words, oral or written. So in example 1, Eric's written lease. In example 2, the used book oral contract. So we have the mutual assent that's manifested in words. Pretty simple. Now the words could be oral or written, but they have to be in words. Then we have the other method of creation, the implied in fact contract. It promises are inferred from actions or conduct. So here's an example. Louise buying the newspaper. Louise goes to the newsstand. Do we even have newsstands with newspapers anymore? Louise goes to the newsstand to buy a morning paper. She picks up the paper and leaves the news agent $3. The contract was completed by their actions. No words used, or necessary. So it's an implied in fact contract. So it's inferred from the actions or the conduct. She picks up the paper. She hands the agent $3. The agent accepts it. No words, but the contract was formed. Then the third method of creation is the quasi-contract. Oh, this gets a little stickier here. It's treated as a contract, but for fairness and equity, no true contract exists. It looks like a contract, but it's missing one requisite element. The court applies equitable jurisdiction to prevent unfairness, and one party unjustly benefited at the other's expense. So this gets a lot more complicated here with a quasi. The key principle is quasi-contracts prevent unjust enrichment when one party benefits without compensation under circumstances where mutual benefit was expected. That's the key principle, where it's expected. Remember, back to intent. But let's look a little more deeply into the quasi-contract with some examples. Here's example 1, Joan and the aunt. Joan completes paralegal training, but she receives a call from her elderly aunt in the Midwest. The aunt is ill, and she needs care, and she promises to remember Joan in her will. So Joan moves to the Midwest and cares for her aunt for 10 years. Then the aunt dies, and Joan is only remembered fondly in her will. All the cash goes to her cat, Fluffy. So, no quasi-contract. The quasi-contract was applied here because there's no express contract existing. She only promised remembered fondly. So no contract existed. There's no mutual benefit, no consideration, but the court permits Joan to recover value of services, her cost.
Biagin Jones, 4492 says de jure or de facto, is it a person or what identification is used as parody and cause in a job biscuit the whole intention?
I'm not too sure there, but the point here is that the only intent that the aunt said was to remember her fondly, and she did, because on the will it literally says there, my niece is remembered fondly. I remember her fondly, but all my cash goes to my cat Fluffy. So this is where it was fairness here, because it was an unjust enrichment. Yeah, maybe there wasn't a full contract, but there was a mutual exchange, and there was an intention when Joan moved there that her let's just say her aunt was rather wealthy, so she was expecting some type of payment in some way when she passed, since she needed her help. So there was that amount of fairness, that there was an expectation. Remember, it's pretty easy to show there's an expectation when you live there for 10 years to go care for someone, and then they give it all to their cat. So the courts will permit Joan to recover her value of services. So let's say her cost of moving there, the cost of living there for 10 years, and whatever other expenses she incurs. That prevents the unjust enrichment of the aunt and subsequently Fluffy the cat. All right, let's move on to the second example here. Sal's newspapers. Sal discovers a newspaper on his doorstep one morning and takes it to work. For the next week, the newspaper arrives at the door every day. So Sal accepts and reads the papers. But then he receives a bill from the publisher. Now, the quasi-contract may be applied because no contract existed. Those newspapers just showed up at his door. But the court permits the publisher recovery. Sal benefited. He accepted the benefit. He must pay. Sal should have contacted the publisher to stop the delivery because they sent that bill to him. There are some exceptions, but most importantly here is that the publisher can only now get costs. They're not going to get the full price of the newspaper subscription. They could just get their cost for delivering it to him. Now, there are exceptions because if it was sent by U.S. mail delivery, the recipient may keep it as a gift, and a lot of state consumer protection laws are there in that regard. So if it was sent by mail, that doesn't apply. It's a little bit different. It's an exception. But there may be a quasi contract applied if it just shows up there and they send the bill and you're accepting it. And they can, of course, show that. Again, that's intent and expectations. Let's move along. So we're on to the third category here, the type of form. It's either a formal
Reagan
contract.
Jones, 4492 says what longest used legalism is of an institution or private company offering services and advice a foreign entity institution with an oath to uphold the fiduciary duties like quasi-semantics.
Yeah, well, everyone's going to be working on the same language when they're writing contracts so that everybody has a meeting of minds and is on the same page, of course. That said, there's two forms of contracts. There's the formal and the informal. Historically, the formal contract, as we were alluding to before here with the person under there, it was written and signed under seal. That was key to have it under seal historically. Nowadays, there's a limited group of contracts designated by state statute. That's where the legal remedies first lie. So that's typically the first place that they hit the courts. Here's an example. Fidelity Bank issues printed checks to customers, enforced as formal contract due to statutory regulations. So there it is. Then we have the informal contract. Simply put, all non-formal contracts. So agreements that meet all requirements of valid contracts, but the form is not regulated by statute, which gets to some of those other forms we were talking about earlier here in the chat. So an example is the contract for sale of used contracts book. All contractual requirements are present, but the form was not regulated by statute.
So Must be 2001 says random crazy legal shit. The only legal fonts are Arial, Courier, and Times New Roman.
Yeah, and Bookman. No, Bookman's another one. They have a few of them now. I guess they get tired of looking at the same ones. Okay, so the contract for sale of the used book, the used contracts book, to make it a little more confusing there. It was a contract for the sale of the used contracts book. All the contract requirements were met, but the form was nothing that was regulated by a statute.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says the papal bull's at play.
Yeah, bulls at play, sure. Indeed. So the point being is that even though it's not regulated by statute, it's still legally enforceable. It's just not of the form. It's an informal contract, and it would be enforced as such. Which takes us to number 4, which is timing. So here's where we're going to make that nice distinction between those two words that are very similar. There's executory contract, or executory contract, and executed contract. So the executory contract is where one or both parties still have obligations to perform. Here's an example. When students agree to terms for sale of used contract book, the contract is formed, but still executory. The book and the money.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says as dag Latin is used, even the name on the contract constitute a legal entity name.
In some cases, and again, when it's applying to statute, but there are other forms where that might not necessarily come into play. But I digress. Here's the example that we have is that when the students agree, the offer and acceptance.
Must be 2001 says they sell court dates.
Oh yeah, well, that's a whole nother topic.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says as dog Latin is used, even the name on the contract constitute a legal entity name.
Again, depending on
Sawyer
the form.
Stash says, great point, must be 2001.
Indeed. So, as we're saying here,
Sawyer Stash says Reagan Jones, 4492.
All right, the icons don't read too well there, but nevertheless, it pops up. Don't worry about it. We'll continue here. So the executed contract is one where the complete and final with respect to all terms and conditions. So it's been executed, meaning now it's either everyone's happy or they're not. But the executory contract is where the obligations have yet to be performed. So back to the executed contract. It's complete and final. Here's an example. Once the book and money have changed hands, the contract is completely executed with respect to all its terms. So here's a note though, executed can also indicate signing of a document. In that context, obligations are still executory even though the contract is executed, signed, like a promissory note or something like that. The signing makes the
Diana
document.
Jones, 4492 says ever seen names walking around in word speaking.
No, but I never see names signing things either. But nonetheless, that's how it's you could say the collective acceptance of these concepts here. Nonetheless, the executed contract, right? The obligations might still be executory, but the contract itself is executed upon signatures. So yes, there's quite a overlap here, as you see here. But when it comes to the contract, we just isolate to the contract itself. Then once it's signed, in this case here, some contracts in some forms, once they're signed, they're executed. Other ones, when they're signed, it's only executory. It depends on the document you're signing. This is executed can mean the signing of a document. That document is the obligation, but the document might imply other obligations. So let's move along here. We're talking about the contract. So let's get down to enforceability because we've been talking about this here. Let's get down to it. We have 3 kinds here, or 4 kinds really. We have a valid contract because it meets all 6 requirements and either party can bring suit for enforcement. So once executed, then it's, or even during the executory phase, there would be a possibility of bringing suit for enforcement. Then there's the void contract. No contract exists. One or more requisite elements are missing, so there's no legal remedy. But then there's voidable contract also. There's one party may avoid obligation without negative consequences. An example given here is minors, fraud, and duress. An example here is a 17-year-old Gene enters a contract to buy a car. Gene can avoid contract, but if he affirms on his 18th birthday, the contract becomes enforceable. So he would reaffirm once he becomes 18 on that contract. So it's voidable. But once he becomes 18, once he affirms that contract on his 18th birthday, that contract becomes enforceable now. And an unenforceable contract is a valid contract, but law offers no recourse or remedy. So an example given here is, well, statute of limitations has run, zoning changes. So there's some unenforceable contracts too. So we have 4 different variations. Valid, all 6 requirements are met, and either party can bring suit for enforcement.
Diana Jones, 4492 says presumption and assumption in tacit agreement in Hersey is the foundation document is the birth certificate if the name is not the man or the woman that would be impersonation of a person.
Well, those elements of factor for the jury, I guess. Nonetheless, if you want to have that day in court, you'd have to have a valid contract. That way either party can bring the suit. If it's a void contract, there's no legal remedy. The voidable, there won't be a legal remedy unless there's certain other conditions that are met. So it may be avoided. One party may avoid it, and there would be no negative consequences. And then, of course, the unenforceable contract, where there's no valid law. I mean, there's a valid contract, but no law that exists for recourse or remedy. All right, let's move along. Because now we can break this down to our classification matrix here. So we have the 5 categories. You got to pick one from each of this. This is our menu selections again. So one obligation. Is it bilateral, promise for promise, or unilateral, a promise for act? So this one here, the unilaterals we learned here, would be executory until the act is performed. Then there's the second classification, the creation. Was it express, implied, or quasi? If it's express, it's done with words, either oral or written. If it's implied, it's done by the actions, like buying the newspaper. You just pay the news agent, and they accept, and then you walk out with the newspaper. Then there's the quasi, just like Joan getting her fairness.
Biagin Jones, 4492 says as the people became a person and then citizen, so the principal and agent relationship must be conveyed whom is whom. That would make things much clearer.
Well, again, like I said, that would be a question for the jury as far as facts go. And of course, there would be a way to prove that status or that capacity. Again, this is something where when you say someone's 17 years old or not having that capacity, that's a presumption. And it could be rebutted. But it is a presumption for the majority of cases. That's just a matter of again, a collective acceptance of these norms. All right, so now we have the quasi, where you have the equitable remedy. And just for fairness or to prevent an unjust enrichment and for one party to benefit at the expense of another when that's not an expectation of the agreement. All right, then we get to the form. There's the formal and the informal. The formal is one with a statutory seal. Informal is any other form. And then we get down to the timing. Again, we have the executory, where the obligations remain, and the executed. It's been complete and final. It's ready. If someone hasn't performed and it's a valid contract, then it can either party can bring it to court. Now we have the fifth classification, which is the enforceability. Is it valid if all requirements are met? Is it void? Then no contract exists.
Biagin Jones, 4492 says as that would be jurisdiction as to move forward with procedures, know whom is whom and whom is acting as whom under presumption and assumption.
Well, exactly. That's the whole point, is that if you leave it unrebutted, then those presumptions may stand. And this is why here, getting back to the previous slide here, was it this one here? Let me go back one more here. No, all right. I'm not going to belabor us going through these. There's one where I wanted to look at something again to address that, but it's back there. You can always backspace it. So the enforceability, we have the valid, where all the requirements are met. Yeah, it was on this slide here. Yeah. Okay, so either party is going to be able to bring suit for enforcement on a valid contract. And the void contract, no one's bringing party. The voidable, it may or may not. And unenforceable, there's no recourse in law. So those are our distinctions there. Valid, all requirements are met. Void, no contract exists. Voidable, one party may avoid without negative consequences. And unenforceable, it's valid, but there's no remedy in law. Every contract has one item from each of these 5 categories. Just one, it can't be 2, just one, exclusive. The terms are not mutually exclusive. So there it is. So let's go over our summary now. We should know a lot about contracts from where we started. The 6 requirements: offer, acceptance, consideration, the top 3. Then there's contractual capacity, legality of the subject matter, and contractual intent. And then we have our classifications, of 5 classifications. The type of obligation has to be one of these, bilateral or unilateral. The type of form, formal or informal. The method of creation, was it express, implied, or quasi? And the timing, executory or executed.
Sawyer Stash says, occasionally the greatest contract enforceability is a random acts of kindness.
Well, the contracts are supposed to provide that.
List V 2001 says capacity is a thing.
Absolutely, and it's what we went over too with capacity. It's also quantified through money. All right, so we have the timing, meaning it's obligations yet to be performed, or it's all done and dealt with, being executed. And then, of course, the enforceability. Is it a valid contract, void? Is it voidable or unenforceable? Every contract will have one item from each of these 5 categories. The terms are not mutually exclusive. Once again. All right, so we've really beat that
Reagan
one.
Jones, 4492 says if the Vatican claim that the names belongs to them in Roman law as part of the legislation semantic jargon, the name was translated to a legal entity.
I'm not too sure that applies in contract, because contracts were executed with a seal. So I don't think it was necessarily a name thing, especially historically. Nowadays, of course, but I think historically in contracts, it wasn't necessarily a name, as a seal was more important. But with that said, let's go over these key terms really quickly here. So acceptance, the manifestation of assent to the offer proposed. The bilateral contract is a contract in which a promise is exchanged for a promise. The consideration, the bargain of a contract. I'm not even going to read these. We're going to leave this on the screen here. You guys screenshot that. I'm going to go to the next grid of key terms for you guys, because we've already gone over these in depth, each of those. But of course here, look, formal contract, though, historically a written contract under seal. Currently, any contract so designated by a state statute. See, so formal contracts used to be under seal. But then there's informal contracts too, which is any non-formal contract. And finally, we have these terms here with unilateral, valid, void, and voidable. And what that takes us to is the best part of the presentation, where we get to do the fun quiz here on contracts. So, with our overview of contracts, we're going to go over these 4 quiz questions. Here's how we play. In the chat, you put in the number of the question you're choosing here, and then you put the letter of your answer selection. So if question 1, I was going to be picking B, I'd put in the chat the Arabic number 1, followed by the letter D delta, and that would be my answer. If I choose to change it, I just put it in again with the same question number and then the correct answer I choose. Your last answer will be your final answer. We'll tally them up at the end and test your knowledge. So let's get started. Quiz question 1. Which of the following...
G5E says 1D.
All right. So which of the following is not one of the 6 requisite elements of a valid contract? We have A, offer, B, acceptance, C, consideration, D, good faith, or E, legality of subject matter. I got 5 selections in here to make it a little bit harder, but I think we already got an answer on this one. Anyone else wants to take a stab at question 1? And we're going to move on
Sawyer Stash says 180.
1E, okay. Let's move on to question 2. Anyone else on question 1? Going once, going twice.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says 180.
All right. So you picked E for number 1. We're moving to question 2. Allison promises to pay Tim $1,500 if Tim paints her apartment on Wednesday. What type of contract is this? A, bilateral, B, unilateral, C, express, D, implied in fact, or E, void? So these are the types. What type of contract is this? What classification of this type?
Bracery G5E says 2.
To A, bilateral. So if she promises to pay Tim $1,500 if... Sawyer
Stash says 2A. Reagan Jones, 4492 says 2C.
All right, let's think about this. If Allison promises to pay Tim $1,500 if Tim paints her apartment, what if Tim doesn't? What type of contract is this? Well, we could say it's not executed until he paints it, but what type of contract is it? Bilateral, unilateral, express, implied? Is it a promise for an act? Those types of things. Is it oral? Is it, or I should say, is it using words, oral or written? And is it legal? All right, let's move along to the next question here. So question 3. Louise goes to a newsstand, picks up a newspaper, and gives the agent $3. What type of contract did Louise and the news agent complete? A, an express contract. B, implied in fact contract. C, a quasi contract. Or D, formal contract. Or E, avoidable contract. So we're mixing up our categories here. Try and make it a little bit more thought-provoking. What type of contract did Louise and the news agent complete?
Sawyer Stash says capital D.
All right, so we got a capital D with a formal contract. So what if they didn't say anything? There's no words. Was there a written contract between them? Did they say anything to each other? Is there any evidence anything happened other than the conduct or the act? So to say it's that, what kind
Reagan
of
Jones,
contract?
4492 says 3B.
All right, we got a 3B in there. All right, excellent. Let's move on to question 4. Any other takers before we move along? All right, we're on to question 4. When 2 paralegal students agree to sell a used contracts book but haven't exchanged money or the book yet.
Craig Curry G5E says 3B.
3B, okay, so we got an answer on this one already, but let me finish the question. They haven't exchanged the money or the book yet. What is the contract's status? Is it A, executed, B, executory, C, void, D, express, or E, unilateral? So, any other takers on question 4? We have an answer for B. We're going to move on. All right. This is the end here. We're taking us to the answer key. Last chance.
Craig Curry G5E says 4B. Sawyer Stash says E.
All right. Okay, so we got all our answers in. I take it that was for B. I mean for question 4.
Reagan Jones, 4492 says 4B.
All right. All right, so we're on to the answer slide. So let's look here what we got here. For question 1, which is not a requisite element of a valid contract? And the correct answer was
Sawyer
C.
Stash says B. Craig Curry G5E says change 2 to B.
Okay, we got that. Indeed. So here's the key here for question 1, which is not a requisite.
Sawyer Stash says change number 2 to C.
No, we'll leave 2 to B. So let's get to question 1 here really quick. Good faith is not an element of a contract. Sure, there's a meeting of minds, but 6 elements are the offer, the acceptance, consideration, the capacity, the legality, the intent. Good faith is not required. So that was a little tricky there, because some of the answers there do seem like they're not one of the regular ones. But of course, the legality of the subject matter is a requisite element. All right, let's move on to, remember, that's about a valid contract. All right, let's move on to question 2. Allison promises to pay Tim $1,500 if Tim paints apartment. What is the type of contract? And the answer is B, unilateral, because it's a promise for an act. Remember, unilateral contract is a promise for an act. Bilateral is a promise for promise. The contract created only when Tim performs a painting. Until the act's performed, no contract exists. So it's not even executory. There's no contract until he performs the act. All right. So that was a little tricky one there too, but the answer for number 2 was B. For those of you that changed it, you get credit for B. All right, let's move on to question 3. Louise buys newspaper at the newsstand. What type of contract? And that's the implied in fact contract. It's inferred from the actions. No words were used. The conduct demonstrates mutual assent to the purchase. So that's the implied in fact contract. Very important one. This is like when you walk into the store and you buy a quart of milk and you pay the cashier for the quart of milk, and then the cashier gives you a receipt and you walk out. Well, if you walk out without that receipt and someone says, "Did you pay for that?" Where's the proof that you have it? Well, that receipt is essentially the title, right? To that, because you had a transaction that it was basically an implied in fact contract. Nonetheless, I digress. Let's move to question 4. The students agree to sell the book but haven't exchanged the book or money. What's the status of the contract? Because we do have a contract, but what's the status? If it hasn't happened yet, it's executory. B, the obligations remain. The parties haven't exchanged the book or money. The performance is pending. So that means it's executory, not executed. Executed, even if it just means signing a particular paper, is executing a contract. And even if signing that paper it means there's further obligations to perform, but the contract, as far as the signing of the paper, has been executed. And in this case here, if they agree to the contract to exchange the books, but they haven't changed hands, then it's not executed yet. It's still executory, but the contract does exist. All right. The offer and the acceptance created that contract. Well, good. I'm glad everyone had a good participation attempt at this one. It was very tricky because as we get into the nitty-gritty of contracts, we see there's a lot of area. And indeed, there's, as we saw from the chat, there's a lot of great fine contention points depending on the contract. But usually the contracts go through smoothly, and this is one of the reasons we have contracts, to keep the gears of society moving. However, when there is any kind of dispute, the contract makes it very easy to bring it before a nonviolent legal forum for resolution and remedy. And so far, this has been our way of approaching these kinds of transactions and agreements in law. And I think it behooves everyone to have a better understanding of it because we are involved, whether we know it, like it or not, in contracts.
Sawyer staff says hope there is more contract information sharing from the tribe.
Yes, indeed. In fact, this is kind of getting you guys started for something. I'm looking at some real opportunities here as we get into the intersection of the logics, the artificial intelligence, and contracts that we're looking at here, that I might be bringing forth some really cutting edge stuff here that now with this under our belt might be a lot more accessible to many, and it's moving ahead with the way things seem to be going with the trends lately. So that said, yes, thank you, and definitely stay subscribed and hit that bell notification, and we will be diving more deeply into contracts. I want to get through this one here of an overview and defining it so we get these fundamentals out of the way here and allow us to move into deeper and more complex levels of contracts without being overwhelmed, and making sure it's accessible to everyone as far as the awareness of these contracts we enter in knowingly, unconsciously, consciously, every day. So
Riagan Jones, 4492 says the doctrine of discovery convey more why we are at this point at this moment of this age.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of factors at play, and
Sawyer Stash says thanks man, peace and pineal power to you and the other us.
Well, thank you, and same to you all, and salute to you all for being here and participating in this. Again, this is what makes it worthwhile, because the more people that have this level of awareness, the less the deceptions can be there to steal the power away that's rightly supposed to be distributed for those that are doing good. And I take it that's all these channel members here and subscribers, so salute to you all. And again, we'll be going down this road of contracts even further, so be sure to stay tuned, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.
The tribe says, get the like.